1917. The world was screaming. Europe was no longer a continent. It was a massive, mud-soaked graveyard. In the middle of this chaos stood a silent, jagged monster known as Vimy Ridge. To the Germans, it was an unshakable fortress. To the French and the British, it was a slaughterhouse. For 3 agonizing years, the greatest empires on earth had thrown their best men at this hill. 100,000 lives were extinguished against these slopes, and yet the German flag didn't even flinch. It was widely accepted in the war rooms of London and Paris. Vimy Ridge was unbeatable. It was a suicide mission for anyone foolish enough to try again. Then, out of the frozen mist came the Canadians. At the time, the world didn't even look at Canada as a real nation. They were seen as a ragtag group of farmers, frontiersmen, and lumberjacks. But these amateurs brought something the grand generals hadn't used in years: a psychological masterstroke. The Canadians didn't just want to fight, they wanted to rewrite the rules of war. While the world watched the surface, the Canadians went underground. Imagine miles of tunnels stretching like veins under the enemy's feet, silent, dark, and filled with thousands of men breathing in the shadows. The German soldiers above had no idea that a literal ghost army was crawling beneath their boots. But the real secret wasn't just the tunnels. It was a terrifyingly precise mind game called the Creeping Barrage. Every single Canadian soldier, from the highest officer to the lowest private, was given a map. This was unheard of. Usually only the elite knew the plan, but here every man was turned into a human clock. They were trained to follow a wall of their own exploding shells, moving exactly 100 yards every few minutes. It was a dance with death. If a soldier moved too fast, he'd be vaporized by his own artillery. If he moved too slow, the Germans would gun him down the moment the smoke cleared. It required a level of mental discipline that bordered on insanity. April 9th, 5:30 a.m. A freezing sleet was falling, turning the mud into ice. Thousands of Canadians crouched in those dark tunnels, listening to the ticking of their watches. Tick, tick, tick. They weren't just looking at a hill, they were looking at a wall of fire. The world was about to witness a miracle or a massacre that would bury the name of Canada forever. A secret was about to be unleashed that would change the map of the world. 5:30 a.m. The silence was shattered by a sound so loud it was heard across the English Channel. Thousands of Canadian guns roared at once, creating a literal wall of fire. This was the Creeping Barrage. But here is where the mind game truly began. To the Germans on top of the ridge, it looked like the world was ending. They dived into their deep bunkers, waiting for the shelling to stop before coming out to man their machine guns. That was the standard way of war. But the Canadians weren't following the standards. While the shells were still falling just yards ahead of them, the Canadians stepped out of their secret tunnels like ghosts rising from the earth. They were walking into their own explosions. It was a psychological nightmare. Imagine moving toward a wall of fire, knowing that if you hesitated for even 10 seconds, the plan would collapse and you would be shredded by your own artillery. The Germans, huddled in the dark, expected a pause. They expected a gap. They expected a chance to breathe. But when they finally peeked over their trenches, they didn't see an army in the distance. They saw thousands of Canadians already standing on top of them, bayonets fixed, eyes cold. The farmers and lumberjacks had crossed no man's land in the middle of a storm that should have been impossible to survive. The fighting was brutal. It was hand to hand, heart to heart, in the freezing mud. But the Canadians had a secret weapon, knowledge. Because every single soldier had been given a map and knew the objective, when an officer fell, the privates didn't stop. They didn't wait for orders. Every man became his own general. They moved like a machine, capturing point after point that the great powers had failed to take for years. By the afternoon, the impossible had happened. The German invincible fortress had fallen. The red and white flag wasn't there yet. They fought under the red ensign. But for the first time, men from Vancouver, Winnipeg, Toronto, and Quebec stood together on that high ground. They went up the ridge as British subjects. They came down as Canadians. But every victory has a haunting price. 4 days of fighting left 3,598 Canadians dead in the slush. Today, if you visit Vimy Ridge, the land is still scarred. There are craters that will never heal, and tunnels that still echo with the breath of the Ghost Army. It remains the most sacred ground for Canada, a piece of France that is forever Canadian soil. It wasn't just a battle won, it was a psychological threshold crossed. It was the moment a colony realized it was a country. Vimy Ridge proved that when you give every man a map, a watch, and a reason to believe, they can move mountains, or in this case, take them. The Suicide Ridge became the Ridge of Hope, and the world finally learned, never underestimate the ones who have nothing to lose and everything to prove.